This Sunday in the church year is called Christ the King Sunday. As we talked about with the kids, you see in our gospel lesson a very different kind of king, don't you? Very different kind of king. A king that is answering requests. Not only requests of pardon, but a king who is answering requests of people that are just on the way to his crucifixion. And they're obviously gathered and mournful, and they're trying to figure out, what is going on here? In this way, he serves. He tries to help them to understand what's happening. Even the ones who are sneering at him, who really aren't asking any questions at all and aren't asking for anything, he helps to understand. Not by what he says to them directly, but by how he responds. He responds as a servant. What does he do? Rather than going head to head with them, he simply remembers them in prayer and makes a request of his Father, acknowledging authority that's beyond him. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Christ the King, the Lion and the Lamb. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Give me the next slide, please. Colossians talks a little bit about Jesus, the King, as well. This whole book is really about the supremacy of Christ. I'd like to take you, if you would, to the first reading in Colossians, and I want to just pick up with verse 19. It says this: "For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him." Which him are we talking about? Jesus, right? "And through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." I want to just point out just how weird that is when we're talking about the supremacy over all things. He says he makes peace through Jesus' blood. He's supreme over all things, but God makes peace through the sacrifice of the one he's poured supremacy into. If you're supreme, should you be suffering? Should you be out on the front lines? Should you be the one shedding blood? And we like that example, and we like that about Jesus, but let's just acknowledge that's not our normal model for leadership, and it's not our idea of kingship. See, this is the kind of king we have. "For by him all things were created in heaven and earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things. And in him all things hold together." This is a really important theme as we think about why I'm here today. My name is Mike Lange. I represent President Bob Newton, and I represent the 187 congregations that are part of the California, Nevada, Hawaii District. It's part of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. I don't represent an office. I don't just represent a president. I represent the missionary work of all those congregations, that which we do together, especially the missionary work that we do in our region. When you think of missionary work, what do you normally think of? I mean, what's the first thing that leaps to mind? You got to go across an ocean or a border for it to be missionary work, right? At least our older members think that way. I find that more of our younger members and my children's generation think a little bit different way. They think of missionary work as everywhere where God's not in charge. And that's my school. That's my college. Sometimes it's my house. It's where I go to coffee. It's who I hang with. It's sometimes where I go to work. See, this is the missionary work that God has given us, and I would suggest to you that as his people, his missionary people, those are the opportunities that God has given you. See, the amazing thing to me about these opportunities for all of us, and I just have to pinch myself every once in a while. You really trust me with this, God? Kind of reminds me when I came home 27 years ago with my oldest son, and we were walking out of the hospital, and I just was feeling really weird. Any new parents ever felt really weird with their first child? When I just felt really weird. Do you know what I felt weird about? It's kind of like, isn't anybody coming with us? My parents were in Missouri. I was in Minnesota, you know. My wife's mom was very ill. She wasn't there. So we were headed home in a snowstorm on our own. It was November 19th, 1989, you know. So it just was one of those weird things, you know, as you trust me with this? And I guess what I was thinking, especially when my daughter was born, is you trust me with this, God? See, the King of all things has chosen to trust us. Who is the King of all things? I want you to think about what I said earlier about the lion and the lamb. Go to that next slide. See, this is the King of all things. And the gospel lesson for today kind of helps us to understand that. Is because he is the lion. He's the Lion of Judah. That's what's talked about in the Old Testament. He is the conqueror. He's powerful. He's able. Okay? And he's able to go to the cross, and he's able to say the things he does, to forgive people, to answer a request. Would you remember me? He's able. He's able to pay the full price. He's able to do all of those things. But what is he? He's also the Lamb. Not just a meek lamb, but he's the sacrifice. The Lamb who was slain, who's alive again, who's begun his reign, and who lives and who's King of our heart. That is Jesus, King Jesus. This is Christ the King Sunday. And it moves so well with what I want to talk with you about for the majority of this message, and that is, it moves so well as we think about what it means to be a missionary people. So I represent the California, Nevada, Hawaii District, like I said, 187 congregations. I work for President Bob Newton, and I facilitate missionary work and missionary training all over our district and beyond. Okay? So my work is not to do it myself or just supervise a limited number of people. My work is really to facilitate, to help people come alive in the areas that they're in and help them to maximize that effort and that energy. So the work of our mission agency is we want to walk together with the baptized, remembering that this is God's mission. I want you to see two things there. Walking together with the baptized. Who's that? Yeah. It's all God's people. It doesn't start and drop off heavily after pastors. It's all God's people. In fact, I like to start outside of pastors. Because pastors know what they're supposed to do. I think they do anyway. It starts with all God's people. The other thing I want you to see is whose mission is it according to this? God's. I don't know about you, but have you ever tried to do something great for God? Anybody ever tried to do that? Oh, come on. Fess up. I know some of you have tried to do great things for God, and I have too. Here's the problem. Every time I get outside of myself and I try to do a great thing for God, you know what happens? I get mixed up about whose mission it is. And I start to think it's my mission that I'm doing for God. You know what ultimately happens? Mike crashes and burns badly. I have broken my nose twice, and one of them was from falling flat on my face. Okay, so if you understand, if you ever have done that, you recognize, you know, that can happen. I want to tell you personally about how that happened to me recently. Now, I've had the chance to walk alongside a lot of different people as they grew up in faith, okay, and became disciples and are becoming disciple makers themselves. Okay, so I've had that opportunity to do that. But there are certain places that I feel really qualified. Do any of you understand what I'm talking about? There's some things you feel like you're capable of and some things you're not capable of. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten better at knowing the things that I'm not good at. Does that make sense? And tried not to do them as much. So I was a little bit terrified when a person that I had all but forgotten about, and I'm ashamed to admit it, confronted me at my home church 2 months ago. His name's Scott. Okay? Scott confronts me at my home church. Scott is 36 years old. He's spent literally half of his life in prison. He was incarcerated the first time when he was 14. Okay? Not quite half, but 12 years. 12 years. So Scott comes up to me, and I had baptized him 5 or 6 years ago. And I had baptized his child, and I was keeping track of his wife and things like that. And I knew he was out, but, I was busy. And honestly, I was glad when Scott went into prison the last time because I was hitting a dead end with him. I was struggling with what to do with Scott and how to handle some of the unique challenges and situations he had. So he comes up to me, and he stood right in front of me like this. And it was one of those things that you can't get by. And Scott is the master of intimidation. And I'm not easily intimidated, but he's the master of intimidation. He was a pretty big-time drug dealer at one time. And he says, does this church do anything to help people change their behaviors or learn how to act in a different way? And I said, well, let me help you talk to the pastor. He says, no, I guess what I'm asking you is, would you do that with me? I didn't feel capable. But see, I baptized Scott, and I have to think about, is God at work in Scott's life? And is he asking me for a reason? Why is he asking me? I'm not capable. Have you ever had those situations? And if you want and expect to be used by God and to respond to his mission, you'll have more of those situations where you have to trust and follow his lead. Individuals, congregations, mothers. Remember, I talked with you about being a father and feeling incapable. I got 4 children now. The youngest one's 20. He's about 3 inches taller than me. That's a big man, by the way. Okay? So he's about 3 inches taller than me. And the reality is I still feel incapable. I still feel incapable. But see, it's his mission and his ability. Now, why do I tell you all of that? Because it's really important to understand when we think about the work that we do together, is that this is his mission. It's his capability. He uses his people in all kinds of different ways. Let's look on. We're going to run through these pretty quick. I want you to see the opportunity that we're located in here in Northern California, where the California, Nevada, Hawaii District is. In our region, which goes down to Lompoc and Arvin, down by the Grapevine, all the way up to Crescent City, all the way east to Elko, Nevada, and all the way west to Kaloa-town, Kauai. Okay? So it's a big region, a lot of different kinds of people. This is what's going on. 15 million people in Northern California, 7.5 million in the Bay Area alone. Okay? And that number's small, by the way. It's too small. 1.5 million to 1.6 million in Hawaii. 1.2 live on the island of Oahu. It's the only place that has an urban population. 800,000 in northern Nevada. I'm not talking about Las Vegas, obviously. But can you imagine, have any of you driven through Nevada? Does it look like 800,000 people live out there? Drive through at night. You'll see all kinds of lights spotted around these gold mines and silver mines, and people live out and around there. Okay? CNH population, that's our 187 congregations, is 40,000. It's shrinking overall, and it's aging. Okay? The unchurched population, however, is growing, and it's 80% plus. I think it's closer to 90. So you could say, wow, that's overwhelming. Or you can say, wow, God has trusted us to be his church in this region? Cool. Think about that. He's trusted us, just like he trusted me to be a dad, just like he trusts you with your friends, just like he trusts you at your place of work, just like he trusts you with your family, just like he trusted me with Scott. He trusts you to live and move and be his people in this area. and to screw up and be forgiven and to grow up. Let's go on. The CNH, that's all of our congregations and our people, I think is up to the challenge. We have a history. We have a rich history of doing more than just growing at the rate that the population does. 2 different times over 20, 30-year periods, we doubled, tripled the actual percentage that the population was growing at, okay, in our churches. And that doesn't mean we were just baptizing babies. We were making disciples. Okay, so we've got a history. It's part of our theology. We have a desire. I know this because I've watched that desire within people, desire of people who have a heart like God's heart. Dawit and Bruce are 2 friends of mine. Dawit's 28, Bruce is about 88. Between the 2 of them, they have been part or started 27 to 28 churches. Now, Bruce obviously has the lion's share of those, but Dawit's been part of 5 at 28 years old. In fact, he's planted as the lead pastor, his first church planting as the lead pastor at age 19. Now, you say, that doesn't work in our congregation. You can't be a pastor when you're 19. We have this funny thing that we do. We allow all kinds of opportunities if you're from another country. Okay? And if you're working with a people group in a specific language, that we don't have that ability. And so those people called him their pastor. He was working under the supervision of another pastor, but they called him their pastor. And God used him in miraculous ways. He grew up now, and he was ordained last Sunday. It was a long road for him. He's Eritrean. He was ordained last Sunday. Like I said, he's on part of his 4th, 5th church plant now. We have opportunity. We have opportunity, as I've talked about, all over this region and in the connections with the world beyond. So what's going on in our district? Since 2013, which is the beginning of the mission agency, there were 3 new church plants. We have 7 active new starts. That means where there are leaders, and there are people, and there's a new group that's being reached. We have 5 intentional restarts. In other words, those are places that the work had just about died or faded away, and those people said, no, we have to do something radically different, and we're willing to change and do some things. One of the prime opportunities of that, or examples of that, is a place down in Hanford called First Lutheran in Hanford, which about 2.5, 3 years ago had about 20 people left. They made some specific changes. They had some good leaders, and they had a pastor who was willing to make changes. The pastor said, I can't make the changes, so I'm going to step aside. I'm going to retire so that somebody else can come in and do that. Okay? And then they began to shift and do some things differently. And over the course of time, the Spirit blessed that. And God was working as their king, and now there are 75 people in worship, and they're doing ministry all over that community in Hanford. Gary, who is their pastor now, called me up or talked with me the other day, and he said, you know, I got to baptize 3 people last month, and one of them was my sister. We have mission conferences for lay people. And for leaders, and we've had 3 of them so far. The 4th one will be March 4th. It's called Missionary People. It is in Tracy, California. Link Bay Area was begun. Link Bay Area is working with indigenous leaders to raise up leaders in the Bay Area and take advantage of all kinds of footholds we have of declining churches, but using those locations and those places to reach new people groups in the Bay Area. And specifically to raise up leaders, and rather than just dropping people in from somewhere else, to raise up leaders, give them the theological, missiological education that they need, sometimes even bringing them towards ordination as pastors or leaders, so that they can start new ministries within the people groups that are there. 1,000+ CNH mission prayer participants are also part of this. So at this time, I'd just like to share with you something that you can sign up for and that you can that you can respond to. You'll see a worship bullet. You'll see an insert in here that has it's a CNH communication card. This one doesn't have one. Do you have one there? I just want to show them what it looks like. Thank you. So this little response gives you the opportunity to be a prayer partner or to respond to one of the other specific needs or interests that you might have there. So if you want to fill that out, give me an email. I'll receive that, or you can put it on the table in the back in the narthex as you're leaving, and just get a little bit more information in that way. But you can be one of those prayer participants. We are looking for leaders, a specific leader in each congregation in our district. So what are we all about? President Newton in 2014 said, we want to be about a new generation planting the gospel among those who are still outside of God's church. Okay? So planting the gospel is at the center of what we do. Who do we work with? We work with specific congregations to assist them in witnessing to their communities. Some of you participated in Greg Finke's Dwelling 114 missional communities. You understand what that's about? Okay, that's one of the partners that we work with specifically and introduce to congregations in this area. And so it was a way that we could bring in a partner to help with witness in the communities. We're about missionary training for all of God's people, not just pastors, and we want to be about new starts for new believers. How does this happen? Behind it all, you see it's about multiplying disciples. Not just adding a disciple here and there or a fan of Jesus, but a fully devoted follower. And one who is confident and recognizes, yeah, I might not have much on my own, but Jesus has a whole lot, and he can make disciples through me. Let's go on. So I want to share with you a few of the circumstances that we're involved with. Some of these are with other language groups, many of them. San Juan Valle de Fe is a bilingual church plant. I know I said that wrong, de Fe. Church plant in Arvin. That's way down south of Bakersfield. Practices reaching into the community and developing partners. They're great at doing community activities. They're great at being about that and connecting with their community. Fourth one from the left, Trinidad Castaneda is their lead missionary. And Trinidad's a wonderful bilingual man. Over the course of time that he's been there, he and his family, which is a little over 2 years, that congregation has expanded from 0 in their Latino worship to 60. Okay? The English worship went from 20 to 30. Now, why did it only go from 20 to 30? Because Arvin is about 95% Latino. So he's uniquely suited for what he's doing. Next slide. Also, I wanted to share with you, this is Temiscan Dobsu. This is kind of a cool thing that's happening. It reminds us of one of the things that's going on in our cities. Some of the congregations have been shrinking, dying, many of them. And so you've got one in Berkeley that's just about gone. I mean, it's on extreme life support. Okay? And you got one in El Cerrito that's right next door. Well, we don't want to lose those footholds because there's tremendous opportunity, especially where you're standing right there at UC Berkeley. Okay? We don't want to lose those footholds. And so those congregations said, yeah, we'll accept the leadership of Temiscan Dobsu, who is an Oromo-speaking man. He actually speaks 4 languages. Okay? He's a Oromo-speaking man, but he speaks English really well. And he is leading their worship services. He's soon to be colloquized and ordained as a Lutheran pastor. He's serving underneath the leadership of others. Temiscan, it was a part of one of our sister churches in Ethiopia, Makana Jesus. He's been over here since 2011. So in return, with those 2 congregations, they get Sunday morning worship and a little bit of time to help them with their ministries outside of that. In return, they pay the majority of his salary, and he's using half of his time to plant a brand new Oromo-speaking church among Ethiopian people. And so it's a partnership that blends together and said, is there a win here for all of us, and especially for who? God's kingdom. Now, I couldn't have thought that up. It's just something that came about. And you just had to be willing to respond to what God was doing and what God was leading. You're part of that. You're part of this by your offerings. You're part of this already. Berhanu Dadanu is right here in the Sacramento area. He and his wife Mercy specifically minister to immigrants. He's just finished his seminary education as well. And so he is now casting about and looking for where is the location that God wants me to serve, to do the work not only with Amharic speaking people, but also with all immigrants who are moving in. And Davis right now, believe it or not, is where he's located at. He works virtually full time. And yet at the same time, he and his wife Mercy are running this ministry on the side. So he's a worker priest. He's drawing very little salary, but he's assisting and walking behind in those ways. Tremendously dedicated man. This is Tesfaye Tessima. Tesfaye planted one of our newest congregations. It's an Amharic and English-speaking church in San Francisco. It's at the old Bethel Lutheran site in the North Mission District. And Tesfaye is now, it's multi-site in a variety of different places. This is Tesfaye and some of the kids from the congregation. This is Dawit. I talked about him earlier. He has just ordained this last Sunday. Got to be at that wonderful celebration. He's leading a core group of disciples who are intentionally replanting an English-speaking congregation in Hayward. And that core group that he's working with are all 20 to 30-year-olds, and they are from about 5 to 6 different language groups, but their primary language is English. And we talk about 1.5. What that means is they were born somewhere else. Dawit moved here when he was 10, but he grew up here. So what's the primary language? English. What's the primary culture? Mixed up. As my friend Bill says, it's all mashed up. Okay? It's a mashup. It's what it is. And so the 1.5 resonate to one another really well in that way, and it's just gaining some tremendous headway. Dawit says, yeah, it's great that we have 5 or 6 language groups represented, but Hayward has 160. So in other words, he said, there's more opportunity. So what do these two guys look like? They are surfer dudes, both of them. Timmy was, I was just with him a couple of weeks ago, and Timmy, one on the left, I said, well, how are things going? How much are you getting in the water this year? Because the waves have been really big on the north shore of Kauai. And he said, man, I'm hardly getting in the water at all. I says, what does that mean? He says, only 3 times a week. But when you live in walking distance from the biggest waves in Kauai, Timmy and Will, specifically, father of 2 on the left, father of 5 on the right, are indigenous to Kauai. They grew up there. This is their home. We tried to start a church there about 8 years ago. It didn't take, it all but died. You know why? We tried to fly in a foreigner. That sounds funny, but he's a pastor who was really interested in being on Kauai until he found out it was really expensive and it's really isolated. And so he only lasted about 18 months, but he got something started. These two guys have nursed it along. They've gotten theological training. Will, on the right, is just about to go and start some long-distance seminary education. He's going to be their part-time pastor until God raises up and grows that congregation to the point that he would be full-time. If you ever get to Kauai, you can worship with them at the library in Kaloa Town near Poipu Beach. Okay, some of you know where that's at. Okay, it's different than what you'd expect. It's very traditional. There's a reason for that. Although it's very traditional, but it's very, well, you looked at those guys. They're informal. So, okay, these are the partners that we work with. It just demonstrates we work with a lot of partners. Next slide. We don't try to do things on our own. Here's the vision: mission training and opportunities for all the baptized. Everybody. Not just pastors, not just teachers, not just those who are going to be them. Intentional mentoring of the best new and young leaders. Your own Matt Molinari is working with us on this, and we're specifically trying to identify what does that look like as we specifically equip generations coming up to be not only followers but disciple makers. What does that look like? How do we do that? How do we do that as best as we can? We want the baptized to see and respond to the missionary call. We want to be about new starts so new believers can be connected in and around our district, and the mission agency has solid resourcing and support so that we can continue to be bridge builders for this kind of thing to happen. So that the personal stories of the Scots and the 3 that Gary talked about baptizing, and the 8 that I didn't mention that will be baptized this Christmas at the South San Francisco Faith Lutheran Church, brand new Chinese English church plant, okay, who are all between the ages of 18 and 31, okay? So those kind of things can happen so that we continue to equip and to walk alongside. God's up to a lot of different things. If you want to find out more about that, I want to share that more with you. What's the means? Prayer, people, participation, and gifts. We're better together. We don't do this kind of thing alone. This is not about what your district is doing on your behalf. This is who we are together as 187 congregations. I'm not in charge of all of this stuff. I'm just facilitating and telling the story. Okay? How will you respond? Please pray. If you have an opportunity to make a relationship, please encourage. Encourage Matt. He's an important part of what we're trying to do with that disciple-making movement and with young people in mission. He's an important part of that. Encourage him. Walk alongside of him. Support. Congregation support. We get a portion of the district support, but individual donors are really important. And so if God has moved you to do something over and above what you do with your congregation, think about that. Not asking for anything today, but it's something that we specifically, it's necessary for what we're doing if it's going to continue. Thanks very much. I want you to remember your King is Christ Jesus. He is the Lion. He's the Lamb. He confronts us sometimes in unexpected ways, and allows us to walk along with him in his mission. Praise be to God. Amen.